Thank you. I've been told to keep it close to my mouth. Thank you very much, Chris and Katja and everyone else for coming, and Dolly for chairing this session. This will have three parts. The first part is, let me get my, the top part is the first part is food fight, and that's where I'll be digging into some of the structural drivers of the food crisis and the dysfunctional food system that we have. And that will be followed by a chat with Dolly and I, elaborating on some of the examples and some of those particular challenges that we have, before we go into part two, which is really essentially what we do about it. How do we get out of the mess that we're in? How do we, as I think we need to do, transform the food system into one in which people and planet are prioritized, a system for nourishing us, and not just making profits for a handful of transnationals. So that second part is the food future part. It's going to be 10-minute slides at the beginning of each of these half-hour segments, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A. So the first part, food fight. Now, which way around does this go? Yeah, so I'm going to, just to say, I was one of the UNICEF generations of the 1980s and 1990s that believed that before we could get to the revolution, we needed the revelation. And that means we need to be sure about the 3 A's: assess, analyze, act. And you cannot get to the action part without doing the proper assessment of the problem, its manifestations, and the analysis of the causes and the capacity to respond. And so that first part, the double A, is this first part now. Here we see three faces of child malnutrition. When I started out in the 80s, I was only focused on the two on the left, child stunting and child wasting. I was only focused on undernutrition. We literally didn't see, and it wasn't a public health challenge, the issue of child overweight and obesity. It certainly is now. The rates are rising of child overweight and obesity. And globally, we are very much in the situation of an obesity pandemic. So we can see, both with regard to adults and children and younger adults, that the rates of increase in obesity have been really very worrying and very concerning, a tripling of prevalence in what's just over about 30 years, which is just over a generation, so that by 2050, if this continues, over half the adults on the planet will be overweight or obese. If we go back to the last 4 decades of the previous century, from 1960 to 2000, we plot what has been happening with regard to prevalence of obesity. And this is looking at the US, where the situation started to deteriorate first. And this is looking at both women and men of different age groups. And we can see something dramatic starts to happen around the late 70s. We'll be coming back to this. What this means is that the change has got nothing really to do with genetics. It's got nothing really to do with a mass failure of willpower. There must be something fast-acting, large-scale, that's acting on the environment, the food environment in which people live. This was a headline from November of last year, which is terrifying. The price tag for the cost of this dysfunctional food system being put at £268 billion a year. 2/3 of this cost falls directly upon individuals and households in the form of premature death, ill health, reduced productivity. We were in an epidemic of sick days. The other third falls on the NHS, welfare and social services. So what we have, I'm going to start to unpick this a bit more, but what we have is a big problem globally, and it's a simple fact that our global food system is now destroying more than it creates. It's destroying a lot more. For the figures that have been shown with the Food Systems Economic Commission are that the damage of the global food system is in the order of $15 trillion a year. That's 12% of global GDP. And that's largely because the system was designed in a different century for a different purpose. It was designed after the Second World War to mass produce cheap calories to prevent famine, and also to buffer the West from the spread of communism through food aid, strategic, deliberate use of food aid. That later morphed through the last 50 years of neoliberalism into a situation whereby food became less and less viewed as a basic need or a human right, and much more as a commodity. The system became financialized, and now it's become effectively captured by a handful of transnationals who are not interested directly in nourishing us, people or planet, but they're primarily driven by the need to maximize profit. And the most profitable foods or products are ultra-processed. Ultra-processed foods are ultra-profit foods. And we are currently in a situation where we don't grow foods, whole foods, to nourish people. The food system generates and produces raw ingredients for industrial processes that lead to a whole myriad range of ultra-processed products. Some of the products of our food system are cattle feed, some are biofuels for cars, but what we don't have is a system that nourishes us. And today is World Health Day, and the number one cause of global ill health right now and early premature death is unhealthy diets. That's been clear for some time. So we have a system that's a mechanism of harm. It's warped into an engine of ill health. And what we need to do to understand why that's happened and how that's happened is to look at power. Where's my thing? Oh, wrong way around. So we're going to do that. Now this is many ways of talking about a food system, depicting a food system, lots of strange conceptual diagrams with boxes and arrows. I'm going to use this one. This shows 10 companies, massive transnational corporations in the middle, big food, who themselves own a lot of other companies. And actually a lot of those other companies own other companies. So it's a series of Russian dolls. This is a power map. This was actually from an Oxfam report from several years ago, but it's still by and large the same. They're the same kind of companies. I think Kellogg's has changed its name to Kellanova, but I mean they're the same type of companies, and actually the corporate capture has become intensified during that period. So we can look at it in different ways. We can look at it in terms of global food supply. These 5 companies control 75% of retail across the world. They're all massive companies, transnational corporations. And if we look upstream in terms of grain trade, we see these 4 companies, anything between 70 to 90% of global grain trade is governed and controlled by those companies there. If we look at the UK supermarkets, 75% of store-bought food is bought in Tesco's, Asda, Morrison's and Sainsbury's. This is what corporate capture looks like. And then we look again at that trend over time, and we see again, sorry, I should say, this is market capitalization value in terms of trillions of US dollars on the left, on the y-axis on the left there, and then it's time going from 1963 right away to 2019 at the base. And we see again different parts of the food system, UPF, ultra-processed food manufacturers, retailers, agriculture, and so on. But the main thing is to look at the blue change in the blue bar, the blue shading at the base there, which is the rise, dramatic rise and increasing control and predominance of ultra-processed foods within the food system. And I don't have time to talk about my story of working with Carlos Monteiro. Many of you know who Carlos Monteiro is. He's a brilliant scientist, Brazilian scientist who I worked with 30-odd years ago, briefly to say that he and I worked on undernutrition. He did a fantastic case study of the success in Brazil of driving down rates in child stunting, but he was quite a worried guy, and I didn't quite understand it. He said there's something dramatic starting, seeing things changing in the country, in Brazil. I don't really know why. And long story short, 10 years later, Carlos hypothesized that that change was due to the ultra-processing of a lot of products that were swamping food environments in Brazil. He came up with a system called NOVA to differentiate 4 categories of foods or food products. And you can see that by looking at tomatoes, raspberries, chicken on the left-hand side in their natural form, going through from left to right when they are processed and when they are ultra-processed. And there is a myriad range of products on the right-hand side that you can get from a simple tomato or raspberry or chicken. each one of those is a profit generator. You see the amount of ingredients that are included. And don't have time to go into detail on all these different features on the right there, but each ultra-processed are hyper-palatable, cheap, they're very ready to consume anywhere, anytime, they last forever, they're portable, long shelf life. And there's a whole new whole vocabulary that is used to describe them. They are also very unhealthy, both for people and planet. There are hundreds of studies, strong observation epidemiological studies showing associations between diets, not just the foods, but overall diets in terms of the percentage of these products in a day that's consumed in a day. Associations between UPFs and these diseases, the ones, chronic diseases, the ones in yellow are where we have the strongest evidence. Kevin Hall in Bethesda in the US was the first person to show in a randomized clinical trial that there's something else beyond just the levels of salt, sugar, saturated fats that is causing overconsumption, that is causing 500 calories a day overconsumption, and 1 kilogram weight gain over a 2-week period with this experiment that maybe we'll get to later on. But it's a fantastic piece of work that really showed that UPF, ultra-processing is conferring some overconsumption or risk overall. It's also clear that this food system that's based on UPFs is generating a lot of environmental harms and is driving greenhouse gas emissions. Let me try and spin through there. We know about, and the fact that these transnational corporations market aggressively for all of us, but especially for children, and the amounts of money they spend on unhealthy food marketing, at least in a sevenfold that relating to healthy food marketing. And you know, there's many ways the system talks about innovation, but the logic of the system is such that any innovation is usually about making more profit. That's why you end up with stuff like this. This is a photograph, and I don't know if anyone else seen it. It disappeared about a week later, but this looks like antifreeze. It's PepsiCo that was on a pallet, which is near the checkout, because they weren't allowed to put it at the end of an aisle, so they made a pallet and stuck it there, so you had to negotiate, navigate around it to get to the checkout. That's what the system demands in terms of innovation, which is clearly not in our interests. I borrowed this slide from Phil Baker. This kind of sets out the corporate vision. There's 1 or 2 more slides at this. This is the head of CEO of Coca-Cola from the end of the 20th century, talking very clearly about how he would like to take over tap water and have us all drinking Coca-Cola. If we remember also that Coca-Cola, 1 liter of Coca-Cola takes 600 liters of water, which is sucked up from the aquifers of many communities, especially in Mexico, where they were completely rampant. 40 years after I lived in a village in India, I read a story, i.e. last year, when I read the story in the New York Times about sugarcane workers in Bid district in Maharashtra. They were forced, 82,000 sugarcane workers, many of them young women, 1 in 3 had chosen to have hysterectomy so that they could continue to work for companies that supplied Coca-Cola and PepsiCo, because if they didn't work, they didn't get paid. They weren't paid very much. And Coca-Cola and PepsiCo didn't comment on this New York Times story. So it's everywhere all the time. The new part of diversification for a big company is finding other markets, which is geographical. This is Malawi. It was never like this when I was working there in the mid-2000s. On the left-hand side is Malawi. On the right-hand side, this is, and Chris van Tulleken's book talked about this particular journey of this Nestle boat into the heart of the Amazon to indigenous communities. And so just to conclude, we'll talk a bit, Dolly and I, about this in the chat, but basically this book started with a discussion not of what I've just described, but of the way in which large companies use market and financial power, which I've just described, to generate political power. And they do this through a corporate playbook, which I differentiated in terms of 5 Ds, listed out here: dispute and doubt, and that is very much from the tobacco playbook when big tobacco realized it couldn't challenge the science anymore, and it had to secure it, and it did that by paying up scientists to write pro-industry, to undertake pro-industry studies. Second D, distort, is where I talk about lobbying. Dodge relates to tax evasion by and large, but also using strategic litigation to delay regulation. I think that's probably, these are some one interesting example of distraction to go along with sports washing, greenwashing, all the other types, is now this new version, which is nutri-washing, which is especially where you have companies that have been associated with rising obesity, PepsiCo is one, now pledging to reduce hunger and undernutrition. So you have those driving overnutrition who are pledging to make very, very small donations to initiatives to supposedly target kids who are undernourished. We will come to this later. We talked about companies, corporations, but governments need to act. They're not acting, and one reason they don't act is because they have this bizarre adherence to this idea of they don't want to become the nanny state telling us what to do and what we should be eating and what types of food should be available. All those things listed out there are government regulatory measures to protect public health. Junk food kills more than any of these measures, and there's a great, we're going to dig into a great piece of work that Dolly was involved in with Henry Dimbleby, Nourishing Britain, where she and Henry undertook various interviews with politicians to understand their impressions of policy and what they, or why they didn't act in many cases to really get to grips with the obesity pandemic or the obesity epidemic in this country. We'll come to that. There it is. So I think that is it for this first segment. That's the problem challenge part, and I think we are now going to be having a little chat. More or less, yeah.
Yeah. I'll speed up this part.
Let me get my notes.
Does this work? Yes, excellent. Thank you so much for that. I wanted to start by asking how many of the people in the room have read Food Fight, just to get a sense. Okay, so we're basically a fresh audience, because I didn't know whether it was helpful following Stuart to give my reflections on the book, because obviously working in this space as well, it's always fascinating to read it, and whether you have those moments of going, oh my gosh, yes, and also didn't know that, which I absolutely had. And I think the most interesting thing about this is not just a book about food, it's a book about power, inequality, racism, gender, the environment, climate change, stigma, addiction, mental health, and slavery. There's so much in our food system that is laced with injustice, destruction, and oppression, which you so persuasively set out, and it's incredibly tight, but it's incredibly jam-packed. I feel like it's a book that you need to read a few times to really see the layers in there that you uncover. But it feels like what comes out so strongly is how intentional the shift in our diets has been by the largest food companies in the world. The drastic shift from essentially what you call real food to fake food, to sort of real to fake ultra-processed food, which now dominates our diet. And we live in a country where now 60% more for children and more for people on low incomes of our diet is ultra-processed. And I told a politician this just before Christmas, and he went, 16%, 16. And I went, no, 60. And he could not believe it, that is the majority. This category 4 of the NOVA classification is the majority of our diets. And that being very intentional, you have a wonderful stat in there, which again I sent to someone else recently, and she couldn't believe it, but the British kids today consume 30 times the volume of soft drinks than their counterparts in 1950. We have seen an absolute drastic, intentional shift in our diets. And I feel like there's been a three-step approach, which you set out, which is make real food unaffordable and unappealing, which check, they've done, and a third of our population, as you talk about today, can't even afford a healthy diet. And step two, make UPF very affordable, often the only thing available and the most appealing and even addictive. And that's absolutely check, step two. And step three, make UPF convenient and ensure that cooking becomes inconvenient, or at least perceived to be inconvenient, and ensure that cooking skills are lost and cooking facilities are designed out in homes and defunded in key places such as schools, hospitals, and even restaurants. And that this catastrophic shift is absolutely happening on a global scale, which you've obviously seen through your work. And you touched upon the Nestle boat, but the extreme examples of it, of Nestle literally sending a boat of ultra-processed food up the Amazon to reach remote villages. Now, we have a lot to discuss, and we're slightly over on time on this discussion, so I'm going to keep it very short and trying to keep it towards some of the examples that you were setting out. But I wondered in the Ds, in the deadly Ds, giving some examples of what you mean by the dispute and doubt, and particularly around the funding of research and thinking about the recent example of Saken and Novo Nordisk.
Yeah,
and
absolutely, yeah. Where to start, where to finish. Yeah, so securing the science, which is the dispute, doubt, sowing doubt, as I say, was very much taken from the tobacco playbook. So it revolves around the challenge of conflicts of interest. We do know, and this is good science, that if studies are funded by scientists who are paid up by industry, it is much more likely that that study will generate pro-industry findings. And this kind of bias is systematic, it's significant, it's 4 to 8 times. I mean, there are different studies have shown that. That's a fact, and that's been shown. Not every single study will be, suggesting that the pro-industry position is the best. But in the aggregate, and given the numbers involved of those kind of studies, we see that very, very clearly. That's a massive conflict of interest. So when we have industry-funded scientists doing that kind of work that has a public-facing aspect or public policy relevance, that's going to cause a big problem. When we have advisory bodies in this country, as we do, we have 9 actually, regular advisory bodies for the food system, and every single one of them is rife with conflict of interest. The worst of them is actually the Scientific Advisory Committee on Nutrition, where 9 out of 15 members are paid up by food industry. That's a massive problem. Same thing goes on in the US. It's possibly even worse in the US. So the conflict of interest, a big issue, a big challenge, and we have to actually, we need, or rather the government needs to really come down hard on that as part of accountability and transparency, and rid these committees and advisory bodies of conflicts of interest.
Yeah, and I mean, flicking forward to today of where we are in the UK, because the government announced that it was going to be publishing a new food strategy, which for the work that I do is sort of a depressing another strategy to be published and not much to happen as a result of it. But we've got this new food strategy in the pipeline. And very recently, the government published the details of its food strategy advisory board. And we know that basically half the members are from large food companies, and the secretariat is a food company or an industry body that's doing it. And we're not just talking about sort of any food companies that might sort of appear to be producing good food. We're talking about McCain Chips are advising on the government's food strategy. As well as Sainsbury's, one of the largest supermarkets as well. And so I wanted to understand your position on that sort of role of the industry, and what is the appropriate way that government should engage with the ultra-processed food industry?
Well, I think there was a mistake, a big mistake made. And the other part of this, the choice and the criteria and the process of choosing board members was never made public. Why was that? Why is that hidden? So we need to know that. The governance of that process is invisible, it's hidden. That's a bad start. Second thing was the actual composition of the board. As you say, it's more than half are industry appointees. And that's actually a major hurdle right from the get-go. We shouldn't need industry participating in that kind of discussion. They can submit evidence, they can contact, provide information and ideas and responses and talk about implementation of policy. But if we're talking about development of a strategy or a policy, they shouldn't be in the room.
And do you think that, because there are alongside the industry representatives on this Government Food Strategy Advisory Board sit independent scientists and independent experts, do you think people like them should also be disclosing their position on industry engagement? Should they be speaking out? What should they be doing using their position?
Absolutely, they should. I think all organisations should be. And there are great examples out there now of clearly stated, publicly visible on websites, principles of engagement with the private sector, or with not with the private sector, but with the ultra-processed food industry that have been developed. For example, by Nutrition International, a fantastic set of very clear principles. UNICEF are very clear they will not work with the UPF industry and they won't take money from it. They won't be sitting next to them on policy discussions. And I think all NGOs working for the public interest should at least state their position.
Yeah.
Any individual is free to do what he or she wants to do, but the organisations need to state their position, and so there's clarity.
I mean, I don't know if anyone followed the House of Lords inquiry last year into food, diet and obesity, but I learnt this during that process, that witnesses to parliamentary inquiries into any given issue do not have to declare their conflicts of interest. So you don't know if a scientist coming to give evidence, is actually funded by the alcohol industry and they're talking about alcohol reduction or whatever. Very naive, apparently, I was to this, because someone else I spoke to sort of said, well, Dolly, what do you think, goes on? But this House of Lords inquiry was the first to make it a voluntary thing that witnesses could do. They could voluntarily disclose their conflicts of interest, and that is a huge move from the kind of position that we were in before, because typically it would only be parliamentarian members of the committee that would have to disclose their conflicts of interest. So we've moved, and actually that House of Lords inquiry did really touch upon conflicts of interest, and one of their recommendations is that they said they should exclude food businesses that derive more than a proportion of sales from unhealthy food from the policy formation process.
Paragraph 48 on page 53, and it was completely violated in the choice of the composition of the board.
Yeah. Very briefly, to finish up on this...
I want to ask you a question too, Dolly.
Well, we'll move on to why governments need to respond.
Governments... because the government should govern, and we need regulations, we need guardrails, we need the lead political authority in any land or any jurisdiction to set the rules of the game and to protect public health. We need the precautionary principle being applied, whereby we may not need the last 2% of evidence before action is taken in the form of policy and legislation. We need the do no harm approach. Clearly, there's a lot of harm is being done. We have the evidence, and the government are just sitting on the sidelines. So the government, politicians often fail to act. They think it's too complex. They're afraid of the nanny state argument gets in the way. They think they won't be around long enough to see the benefits. But I wanted to ask you, based on this fantastic work with Henry, what were the main findings from this? Why did you do the work in the first place? Why did you choose to ask questions of politicians from the past to get an understanding of what had happened or not happened, and what were the main findings of this work?
Yeah, I mean, we did it because it's sort of all good and well, someone like me and someone like Henry Dimbleby saying, oh, you should be acting, you should be doing X, Y, and Z on food, when we don't know what it's like to be Prime Minister or Health Secretary, and it's very easy to wag your finger from the outside. So part of the motivation was trying to understand what is it like being Prime Minister, and you're faced with these, enormous, endless policy lists of priorities that you have to make, and all sorts of difficulties and challenges. What is it actually like dealing with this agenda? So we wanted to put that forward, and we knew that if we got the kind of current government's predecessors saying what they ended up saying, it would be much more powerful than two outsiders preaching to them about what we think they should do. And it was genuinely, we were curious, because you do see time and time and again government come in and just doesn't solve this issue, and it is really fascinating to ask the question of why are the politics so hard on food? Why is it that a government, it's often my husband who says, you know, why can't the Prime Minister just introduce universal free school meals or whatever? What's holding them back? And part of it was trying to discover that. And we basically discovered the fact that it was all the typical things that you would expect, that politicians are incredibly busy and their capacity and their political capital is incredibly limited. So there were all of the things that we, you know, just as a human being in that position, you could sympathize with. But on top of that, this is a very negative agenda. So the perception of intervening on food is seen as something where you're a nanny statist, you're going to increase the price of food, you're a kind of middle class elite lecturing people about what they should and shouldn't do. It doesn't have the kind of positive association that you get with food in other countries. So when you hear Italian politicians talking about food, for example, it's in this wonderful pride, you know, nationalist almost agenda. It's just a very, very different rhetoric. So you have that, and then you've also obviously got the nanny state fears, which you touched upon. That was absolutely the number one barrier. Literally every politician we interviewed, and we interviewed 20 prime ministers, health secretaries, and other relevant senior politicians, they all talked about the nanny state. But they also talked about industry arguments, and it wasn't just as simple as being lobbied, which is usually what you would expect with this, of the way that industry influences their position. But it was the fact that they felt like intervening was going to harm the industry in a negative economic way. And so they were in this fear of anything that they would do would be perceived to be anti-business. And you could almost, if you reflected on their words, you could almost see, I just think of your Deadly D's, you could almost see the work of the industry over decades having their effect, because they were making the arguments of the industry without, I don't think, even realizing that they were industry arguments. And it was stuff like, we couldn't possibly ban buy one, get one frees, which is now luckily coming into force this year, but ban buy one, get one frees on junk food, bearing in mind it's just on junk food, it's not on all food, because they said there's a cost of living crisis and we shouldn't be, you know, harming people unnecessarily. And it sounds intuitive, of course, if you're stopping buy one, get one frees, but why does the industry use buy one, get one frees? Because they get people to buy more. And so it's about purchasing more and buying more. It's not sort of industry's way of giving away free food. And so those arguments are used by politicians. So industry don't even really have to do much. They sort of have these politicians making those arguments for them. And the fact that food security and these other issues, for a lot of politicians, they talk about food security as meaning access to any food. And so they, you know, we don't have time to get nourishing food, you know, any food is what's important. And so you have these sort of almost defenses which can make it very difficult. And my husband was interviewing a psychologist today who was an expert in change, talking about how difficult it is for our minds to be changed. And I feel like if you're talking about changing our attitude towards food, and our thinking about food, which has been so heavily shaped by the largest corporates over literally decades, if not centuries, which you know, Benjamin Wood's work has shown, we're having to do a lot of deep unpicking of the way that we think about food and how it's shaped us. And we don't like to think that it's been shaped by external influences, but unfortunately it has. And that's very much seen in the responses in Nourishing Britain. Shall we?
I have no idea what time it is.
Yes, I think we should move on, and
right.
we can talk about the other government side after the next bit.
Great, thank you. This is much shorter, this segment. So we are now moving into action. We need to move into action. Oh, we've done that. We've had a discussion of the challenge. There's a picture of an elephant hawk moth. This is an example of a transformation. I used to collect butterflies and moths. I was absolutely fascinated by this creature. The transformation, you know, a different purpose, looks different, acts different. We talk all the time. The first thing we talk about, actually, when we talk about food systems, or one of the number one things that's mentioned, is the system is broken. It's not broken. It's not. It's fit for purpose. It's just fit for the wrong purpose. So it's controlled by people, and it's doing exactly what they want it to do. We need a different system. We need to change the system. We need to transform it. We can't just repair it. We shouldn't be doing incrementalist tinkering at the margins. We need a significant radical overhaul of the overall system. So how do we do that? I think, first of all, everyone has a role to play, but I think two of the biggest roles to play are on the part of the government and ourselves as citizens, and linked in with community groups and civil society organizations. And I see it almost as a bit of a nutcracker kind of pincer movement, top down, bottom up, and the nut being the problem, if you like. Maybe that doesn't work so well, but both are crucially important and both inform each other. So in terms of governments, you know, I like things like D's and I's, and so now I've got 4 ins in terms of what governments can do, and it also supposedly helps memory. Institutions, so a huge role and potential role, which is again not being played as well as it could be, on the part of the government to procure food, healthy food and diets for various government agencies, for schools, and here we have school feeding, universal school feeding, which is great examples from all around the world. We're not doing enough on that in this country. Clinics, hospitals. You've seen what hospitals look like and the stuff that's in the vending machines and in the reception of hospitals. This wonderful Kenyan lady, Wawira Njuru, who was 20-something, 2 when she went to Australia, did a master's in nutrition, decided she'd put that to practice when she came back to Nairobi, or a little town outside Nairobi in a poorer community, set up, rented a small building with a corrugated roof and fed 25 kids from donations from some of a local fundraising. That got bigger and bigger and bigger. She went to India, where she learned from the Indian program, which is the largest school feeding program in the world, actually in Bangalore. She came back and then she formed an NGO called Food for Education. The government started to invest in it, and by 2021, 30 million meals had been fed to school kids. This will be universalized in the next 5 years over the entire country of Kenya. That's an example of the power of one individual and the change that can be made. That's institutions. Now, incentives, and without getting too complicated, I see this as both incentivizing the good and disincentivizing the bad. We can level the fiscal seesaw if you start on the left-hand side by really looking at what the subsidies, I haven't talked about that, but large-scale production subsidies on foods that end up as UPFs. What are they there for? How are they all needed at that level? Isn't there a transition away from that? Taxing harms. Part of that is we have a sugar tax on drinks. We need maybe move that forward towards more junk food taxes, and that's happening in other countries. That's down-regulating the unhealthy. Then we can up-regulate the healthy by using the tax dividend, or earmarking the tax dividend from the left-hand side to subsidize healthy food purchases for low-income families on the right-hand side. And that is being tried elsewhere. I've never seen a good reason why that can't be done, although people do often say that that's complicated, but there's a lot more complicated things than that. This is information, and here we're talking about regulating labeling, advertising, marketing, commercial promotion of UPFs in all media. In Latin America, they now have these black octagons, where it's high in sugar, high salt, high in saturated fats, high in energy density. And every time a certain threshold is breached in terms of those nutrients or composition, you get a massive black octagon slapped on the package, and that's having an effect. And if you get enough of these black octagons, you have to take away cartoon characters, like Tony the Tiger. It disappeared. What happens, though, the industry's got wise to this, and so they have people walking around supermarkets dressed as Tony the Tiger. Even though he's not allowed on the package, they can't stop people wandering around looking like Tony the Tiger. They turn the front of pack labels round so you don't see the octagons. So there are all sorts of tricks. Another one is when you actually print the actual label on the food itself rather than on the package, which is another means around it. So and the fourth IN is interest. And here, as we talked earlier, we really do need to rid our advisory bodies and dietary guideline committees of conflicts of interest. We need to clean up lobbying. The lobbying report that I was involved in showed that in a 5-year period, there were 35 lobbying interactions between government ministers and health, food, diet NGOs over a 4-year period, 35. There were 1,308 such meetings with Big Food. A 40 times difference, and because they have the power and the money to do that, and they do that often with third-party organizations. This is a fantastic book that was written 41 years ago, and there's a big story around that I talk about in the book, and I can't talk about it now, I haven't got enough time. The The approach paper there was where the analysis was done of the 9 food regulatory bodies by Eric Milston and Tim Lang to show them all rife with conflict of interest. If all else fail, those are serious measures, and I believe we need to do them all at once, or at least move to have them simultaneous because they generate positive interactions. But if companies are continuing to be difficult, and they're upstream investors, hedge funds and asset management companies, then these what I call the nuclear option: disperse, democratize, and if those two fail, to dissolve companies in terms of complete revocation of privileges. All this is possible on the part of governments. Then we have citizens, ourselves, and civil society. So much can be done, and quite a lot is being done now. We need more. We can expose and oppose. We can harmful products and practices, use evidence and experience to educate and advocate, hold government to account, monitor, shine a light on malpractice, but also good practice. Organize, mobilize, build social movements, and disrupt business as usual. Easier said than done, but there's a lot of work that's, as I say, beginning to happen, especially among youth groups who are highly active now, and I think having some significant impact. I did some work with the Food Foundation on running a series of regional webinars of urban food justice initiatives across the world, and it was a complete eye-opener for me. I didn't realize how much was going on at the level of cities. In this country, Birmingham was a great example, Brighton is another, London in terms of the transport network, but across the world, fantastic examples that we bring together. So we must also remember the power of municipalities and city mayors. Everyone has a role. This is pretty much the final slide. And I have this possibly naive view of pressing all the buttons or pulling all the levers, because I do think there's so much more in terms of the interaction is positive rather than a negative trade-off. We can look at negative trade-offs, and maybe we don't in those cases. But government, citizens, civil society, cities, industry. Industry has been innovating along technological grounds to maximize profit, maybe with a new, well-set, well-defined parameters for a new food system. That innovation will be more social, and we will see people and planet prioritized over just pure profit. Media, in terms of stories that are told, too much of the media is reactive. We don't see enough, I don't think, enough deep dive kind of investigations. Research and academia. I spent many decades in research and academia, and it's only recently that I've started looking at the commercial determinants of ill health, and we still don't have enough, certainly not in nutrition and food. More on the health side, we need more on that. And international organizations have a big role to play in this, as they always have had, in terms of setting norms. There's so much of this is supranational, above the level of individual countries. That is it for that part.
We're going to be positive in this half. We've got sort of 7-ish minutes, but the most important thing is lots of time for Q&A. But I wanted to dig in a bit into the detail of some of the international examples, and there's a lot of attention on what's happening in Latin America, and a few of the examples that you were showing are things that are happening in Latin America, and whether you can give a little bit of a background into why Latin America is doing things differently.
Yeah, it is really interesting. So Chile, Colombia, Brazil, and Mexico, they all have great sort of scholar activists, actually. They're not just researchers. They may be directors of National Institutes of Health, but they're very politicized. And actually, if you look at the transition, so-called nutrition transition, as it occurred in Latin America, the speed at which these food environments were swamped, especially from North America and from the US, that you can see that almost like a tsunami coming from the north that probably triggered this awareness and realization, especially in the case of Mexico, where the shocking stories of the way in which Coca-Cola bought politics, basically. And it led to a situation in the 2010s where 40,000 people were dying every year due to overconsumption of Coca-Cola, which is being promoted by the president, who used to be the CEO of Coca-Cola, and all his allies and friends and who were in positions of power. And they were just giving free bottling concessions across the country. Kids were growing up drinking Coca-Cola. It had 1 in 6 people in Mexico had type 2 diabetes during that time. Absolutely appalling. Mexico is one story. Brazil was Carlos has been working there. And in Chile, I tell the story of Guido Girardi, who was a senator who for 15 odd years was fighting junk food. And these are guys who get death threats. They get Pegasus hacked onto their phones, and they keep at it. And I don't know if I'm answering your question, but there's something about the power and the and there's a history of liberation struggles, of course, that is really inspirational. So I tell lots of stories of the Latin American struggle and experiences.
I mean, it's so interesting because the speed feels particularly pertinent, and that seems to be the thing that struck me of why has the UK not had that kind of response? Why does it not look at the ultra-processed food industries in the same way? And it feels like the speed at which it's happened in Latin America and other countries feel like you can see it much more. Absolutely. And you can see that corporate influence, whereas we've had it, we essentially industrialized 100 years before many of our European neighbours and have had that takeover in a much slower over decades. So our nostalgic associations with a lot of these brands are from childhood, even earlier. And interesting in the way that they've done things as well, because it's also led to a lot of the countries being much more open to the concept and definition of ultra-processed food, whereas we still have a government that if you look at the last response that a government minister has given about ultra-processed food, it's taken from and usually quotes SACN, which is the Scientific Committee on Nutrition, and it's the one that Stuart mentioned. The majority of the members are funded by big food, so lo and behold, what they said is there's not enough evidence to act on this, and we don't recommend it, unsurprisingly. So we still have a government that's unwilling to recognise formally the definition of ultra-processed food, although they have mentioned it and given nods to it in some of their strategies before. But is that recognition of step one, and then also these coherent policy approaches. They have labelled the food with those big black octagon warning labels, and then it's those foods which are based on an ultra-processed definition usually, although applied to processed foods as well. It is those foods that are then banned in schools and hospitals. They're the ones that are taxed in the case of Colombia, and they're the ones that have marketing restrictions. So they have this sort of coherent policy approach, like you say, a sort of multi-pronged.
Absolutely. And today, was it last week, that Mexico has formally, throughout the entire country, banned junk food from all schools. It's out. And that was quite quickly done from announcing it to actually doing it. I mean, I'm assuming it's been done, but it was meant to be done 29th of March.
Yeah, really interesting. And there's another you can't read Stuart's book and not come out with a very particular view of power and the concept of power. And your book was the first to make me come away and look at the policy recommendations that people in the activism and advocacy and even the academic space put forward, and to actually look at how few policy proposals address power. A lot of them are just about the product. So it's about reformulation or, marketing restrictions or whatever, which, in many ways you could argue is a form of power. Which made me even more intrigued looking at Reform's manifesto last year. Reform was one of the only parties, and I haven't fully checked this against the others, but it has a power-based recommendation on food in it. And it's because they come at food from the perspective of the farmer. So they have a policy recommendation or policy commitment in their manifesto, which is about stopping supermarket fixed pricing and to be on the side of the farmer. And they also have a policy commitment which relates to your point on food procurement, that 75% of the food procured for schools and hospitals and public places should be British. So I was interested in the fact that, Reform, which obviously is interested in the populist agenda and what's publicly popular is touching upon these notions of power when it comes to farmers. And, should we in the activism space on food be moving towards power-based or thinking about policy recommendations from a power-based perspective?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, because there's no way in the world we're going to make a significant transformative change without addressing the power imbalances and the asymmetries. And power operates, as I said, in many ways, market, financial, political. And there's epistemic power, which is the power of the story or the narrative that media can contribute to. And a lot of the stuff I haven't had time to talk about, sowing doubt, is the way that language is used. Yeah. And this goes right back to big fossil fuel companies talking about litter bugs and carbon footprint, always individualizing stuff. And then the nanny state thing, we don't want to be associated with nanny state, because so language is used deliberately and has been, for decades in this way to subtly convey the same pro-industry message. But yeah, power is crucial, and we can't, and it's either hidden or it's overt or covert. Either way, we need to look at the way it's balanced across the system.
Yeah. In the interest of time, just a couple of minutes on these final points, but related to your point about the language, and you touch upon the concept of reclaiming the notion of freedom in the book, and the fact that these terms, these positive terms of freedom and choice, and we just want to eat what we want to eat, all of that has been almost weaponized and co-opted by the industry, and how we need to reclaim that.
This is totally infuriating. Yeah, the way the notion of freedom has been co-opted, that we don't go near big food. It's exactly because of big food and because of the way markets have been saturated and swamped. Where is the freedom, especially on a low-income single mum, for example, in a poor neighborhood, to actually access and afford and cook and prepare a healthy diet? That's the real freedom we should be looking at, and the rest of it is almost deliberate co-option of that language. And then of course I mentioned George Orwell's freedom of speaking truth to power as well, and that's another part of this. And then I think finally Marcia Sen talks about freedom as being not just the end but the means. Yeah. And we need to reclaim that word. Yeah.
And interestingly, Lord William Hague did in some of his Times columns, he talked about the freedom from unhealthy environments within a conservative ideology, and also that true health is true freedom, that it's the foundation of all other freedoms, which is fascinating to look at from the political side. And finally, on the sort of positive role of activism, and I guess a call to people in the room of the question of what can be done. And both of us in many ways is quite similar. We're sort of researcher activists, and that sort of plays a role in what more should be done. So what do you think people can do about this? And
yeah, it's interesting because I just wrote a paper last week called "Use Your Power," that's right, which is more in response to the situation in the US right now with science and scientists and the behavior of a certain person, trashing science and everything else, the world, including the world. And there are three things. One is break out your silo, make connections with other people, other scientists, other disciplines. And this, again, is coming from the perspective of an academic or a researcher, but also a policy person. USAID, for example, is being just decimated. Number one, break out your silo, connect. Second, remember that we have individual and collective agency. We have both as individuals and groups. And the third is ditch the despair, act now, but play the long game. Think ahead. Things are going to take time, but we need to act now.
And interesting that the one very, very strong recommendation that came out of Nourishing Britain and the interviews that Henry and I did with these politicians was the fact that they didn't feel that this was a voter demand issue. So ever since doing this work, I have gone out and asked people to contact their MPs and make it something that MPs feel the heat from the public about, that this has to be a public demand issue. Again, there's a bit of an eye roll when it comes to food activists or people, particular NGOs. Of course they would say that, of course they're going to ask for that, but they do not want their voters or constituents coming to them and saying, if this, you know, is something you're not going to act on, we're not going to support you as our MPs. So my ask to everyone here listening is to contact your MPs and to make sure that they feel the heat, they feel that this is a public demand issue. And also, because I have my 50-50 Parliament bag, to ask people to stand yourself. You know, what an amazing thing if we can get people interested in food actually standing for election, including you, Stuart. I have stood, so I'm, you know, I'm not being a hypocrite. But standing on a food manifesto, we don't actually have that many members of Parliament who know about this agenda, who come to politics with food being their primary motivation. And that was also very clear that this isn't seen as something that's a reason to get into politics. So whatever party you are, or independent, I'm asking you to stand, or march, or both. And on that, we should leave the last chunk of time for questions. And I think you're going to be selecting. So hands up if anyone has any.
All right, we've got a question right back here.
Hi, my name's Clementine. I obviously into food, as my name would suggest. I'm a dietitian, clinical dietitian, nutritionist also. I work in women's health. What I find is really interesting is what I do understand around the demonization of ultra-processed foods, but one of the things that they do bring is convenience. And I see a lot of women in my practice, women's health, and what thing that does do, it liberates them from time. So time to be with their children, time to have jobs. So I think in the work that you have done, do you address at all how moving to more whole foods, which obviously I do massively advocate, but how that is going to impact specifically women who we know are the main caretakers, the main, you know, housekeepers, etc. So that disproportionately affects women.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. That is one big part of a big challenge, which is we're probably not going to have convenience going away as a positive attribute of any food system. We need to think in terms of how to make a healthy diet option, or cooking, or eating, the culture of, and including being convenient, so that we protect and the ability to do other things in life. So that is a challenge. I didn't really talk about. Didn't get to the detail of how that might happen, but that is something that we need to take on board. Absolutely, 100%.
All right, we got one back here.
Hi, I'm Barry Smith. I know you, Stuart.
Oh, hi, Barry.
Hi. So I'm wondering about the strategy and the tactics here, because there's a sense in which it's a very confused fight. You know, when we talk about using science on our side and having, you know, maybe active researchers, the trouble is the way it's set up is kind of making things very obscure to the public. My sense is the public are really concerned by ultra-processed food. My other sense is that, unlike the food industry saying define it, nail it down, make sure it fits all the categories, the public aren't concerned about that. And the other thing is that, you know, we've got people in science and in the food industry doing the science saying, show us exactly which compounds are toxic, show us exactly how the mechanism works that is causing these dietary related diseases. They're showing us that, you know, however well we try to classify, there are going to be some foods that don't look as though they're harmful, but they fit inside. And they say all this, forgetting there isn't a scrap of evidence on the other side that these foods are doing us good, or in fact, they're improving the nation's health. So I'm wondering whether we get into that rather pointless scientific debate, or whether tactically we've still got to stay at a level at which we say, look, the evidence is really rather clear. The science will be worked out, not to get into those hand-to-hand skirmishes.
Yeah, absolutely. And we need to push back against reductionism, this nutrient-centric approach to composition when we're talking about the big picture of a diet that's flooded with ultra-processed foods that we know and from evidence in the aggregates are harmful and not. And again, it's not this. The precautionary principle as well would apply in terms of what we know and what we don't need to wait for understanding what toxic. We shouldn't be focusing on these individual ingredients in that way, and that's part of the old style. That's the pro-industry position, to discredit anyone who doesn't understand additives or food science processes. And I think it's a deliberate part of the distraction, actually, in many cases, at the larger level of policy for public good.
And delay is the most effective tool for the industry of earning tons of money in the time that it takes the government to decide on something. And we see it time and time again. I did the most amazing industry interview, and the person told me stories of successful delays and how much it made particular companies over the time that they didn't have a policy come into force. So every time I see the government making the arguments that you're talking about of going, we just don't know exactly about that particular relationship and whatever, we have to be really strong on, we've got way more than enough evidence to act now. Other countries are already doing it. We already have countries saying with warnings in their national dietary guidelines about the high consumption of ultra-processed food and the effect it has. And then we even have taxes and other UPF-based policies being introduced. So I personally absolutely reject the idea that we need more research before we start acting. We can act now. And it relates to your point, Clementine, that because it's a really interesting one, I come at food from totally the real whole food, however you want to describe it, the most convenient, the most delicious, the most pleasurable, affordable, everything, every barrier that we have to consuming it, the availability around should be addressed, and that should be the primary objective of any policy, that you end up with something where real, whole, minimally processed foods are the most affordable, most convenient, most accessible, and most affordable for everyone. And I think that's the only way, the only lens. It shouldn't be a reason to have UPF dominating our diets. I have an 11-month and I feel, much more able to do these things now.
Hi, thank you very much, both of you. I have a question about your position on the role of tech in a healthy food system. We obviously there's no healthy people without a healthy planet, and there's lots of interesting innovation going on around things like cocoa-free chocolate or ways of using technology to address sort of really big issues in the agricultural production of foods. How do we stop that becoming a repeat sort of problem of the way that ultra-processing has damaged the food system?
Because we stop that through resetting the parameters of the system. Resetting purpose. What's the purpose? If we need to transform, we need to move away from this system that's prioritizing stuff that's really bad for us and the planet to a better system. And that requires resetting the rules, the guardrails, etc. And once there's clarity on purpose, there's no reason that industry have to play by the rules, that they cannot technologically innovate towards finding a healthier diet so that it may be more convenient and more accessible and affordable. That's not just about profit. We're not completely necessarily against profit, but it's profit would be in the service of ensuring access to a healthy and affordable diet for all, especially low-income families. So that technology follows purpose and resetting the system.
Great. We've got one right back here.
Hi, my name's Piers. I work in the earlier demonised asset management industry. But what would you say, or how would you draw the line between your definition of ultra-processed food from a public policy perspective, and what evidence is there to suggest that this is the tipping point into the obesity epidemic?
Well, the first thing you just said, I was in a meeting last week of asset... what did you say, your asset... Sorry, I missed...
As in where I work?
Yeah.
Asset management.
Right. So I was in a meeting of investors, and it was last week, led by the Food Foundation. It was fascinating that the interest in, being part of this discussion and moving towards a bigger purpose that's focused on people and planet. Completely missed your question. I mean, the UPFs...
The definition.
The definition...
For public policy.
To repeat it.
Sorry.
That's all right. So from a public policy perspective, where do you draw the line on the definition of UPFs, and what evidence is there to suggest this is the tipping point towards the obesity epidemic?
I mean, we have, the second part, we have a lot of evidence that UPFs in the aggregate, i.e. in terms of a high level, a proportion of the diet are driving obesity, diabetes, and all those chronic diseases I mentioned. Do you have any thought on the other part of that question?
Definition.
I think there are always going to be, if you're talking about certain foods that may or may not be good or bad. Is that where you, there are always going to be boundary issues and challenges in terms of whether this is on this side or that side of a line. But what we should be looking at are proportions within a diet. We know the massive proportion of a lot of these foods which have more than 5 ingredients, they're shrouded in day-glow plastic, that are unhealthy, comprise a huge chunk of the diet in this country. And that's the challenge, and whether certain foods are in or out. It's more about pushing a new purpose, building a new purpose, and focusing on that aspect rather than whether it's on this side of a line or that side of a line. I think that and the mechanisms of harm, we still need research on that. We need to keep shining a light and understanding more about what it is. Is it additives? Is it something that's toxic component that's generated through ultra-processing? Is it emulsifiers that sort of mess up the microbiome? Is it something to do with the gut-brain signaling mechanism that's disrupted due to the high energy density or the low protein or low... All these things are mechanisms through which UPFs are generating, or may be generating harm. We don't know which one is more important or less. That work is ongoing, or at least it was in the US until Trump pulled away the funding. So I don't know where we are with that. But,
I mean, in terms of definitions, there is an internationally recognised definition that's used, including by the UN. And we, as I mentioned earlier, lots of governments are already acting with a definition that's legally binding on ultra-processed food. So we only have to look at, around 12 other countries globally to see a definition being used legally, and through legislation like the Colombian tax example being a really good one. And it's interesting on the point of the your position from the investment side, because there's this incredible body of academic research being produced led by a guy called Benjamin Wood, and anyone who's interested in the sort of profit aspect of the ultra-processed food corporations, and to understand, because both Stuart and I have had this conversation, of course we're not anti-business, in quite the opposite. I'm incredibly pro-business. I want to see a flourishing of the kind of food businesses that I would love to have easy, affordable access to around where I live. I'm often in a position where there literally isn't an option around me to buy the kind of real food that I want, and I find that not the kind of free market world that I think we should be living in. It's absolutely not a free market when you look at the oligopoly of basically 5 or 4 companies running our entire food supply chain. And what Ben Wood and his colleagues have shown is that the largest food corporations not only make majority, in some cases all, ultra-processed, unhealthy ultra-processed food. So in terms of choice, there is very little if you're looking at it through the lens of real food to ultra-processed food. But they have, and this is the interesting argument politically, because politicians are going, we're worried about, the economic hampering on these kind of corporations. And they'll say, if you introduce this tax, we're going to have to cut jobs, we're going to have to cut production costs, etc., etc. Ben Wood and colleagues have shown how the companies themselves, year upon year, have been cutting jobs, cutting production costs, minimizing their tax payments in order to pay their shareholders a greater proportion of their revenue per year. And it is in the millions, trillions, billions. I mean, it is astonishing the amount of money that's going to shareholder payback schemes relative to their real economy contributions. And I asked Stuart, do you think collectively the UPF corporations are net contributors to the real economy or net extractors? And they are net extractors. So there's a reason why food is expensive and we don't feel the money in our pockets when you've got these great expansions in these companies.
And that's why it's also infuriating and exasperating when you hear Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer talking about not stepping on the toes of big business. Yeah. UPFs, a large part of big food, large part of big business is big food. UPFs are a drain on the economy. They're not pro-economic. They're literally doing the opposite. They're sickening us. And also, to what extent do our politicians want to think about children and their children, the future generations? Because the cost is going to be paid further down the line.
Yeah.
All right, we've got time for 2 more questions.
Hi, I'm not a nutritionalist. I'm just a common citizen. I've worked in development my whole life, but I think you people, if you don't mind me saying so, tend to over-intellectualize all of this. There are some very basic facts. Soft drinks, you mentioned it. They abuse water, and they are creating a tremendous problem in terms of obesity. Diabetes, just take it from the National Health NHS point of view. It's the second most important use of funds of the NHS. I think if you would just focus, keep it simple, just focus on the big problems, educate the world, people like me, to that problem. I use something called HelloFresh. I hope this is something you could sign up for. I hope it's in your neighborhood. But anyway, it's healthy, it's good food, and the cooking of the stuff is like 20 minutes to 25 minutes. Any working mother or father could usually afford that to keep his family healthy. So I think if you would focus more on just the big picture and the big problems and educate people like us to these big problems and big picture, I think you'd be much more successful. Sorry.
All right.
I agree, if there's any consolation. We tend to be very technical.
Totally agree with the big picture.
We need the simple public messaging.
All right.
We have time for just one more question. But before we do that, I'd like to thank the audience for coming this evening and thanking the panelists for coming as well. Before we jump in, last question. Please make sure you visit the Stanford's stall at the back, buy yourself a book and get it signed in the corner just over there. Please make an orderly line along the wall. And after you got your book signed, feel free to head up to the third floor where our panelists will be going up and having a little drink as well if you want to continue the conversation. And the final question of today comes from our community, and it is the following. What's one thing that you'd like the audience to take away from today?
My book.
I said mine. Stand for election, or at least contact your MP in the next week about this issue.
No, sorry, I agree with her, but the most important thing is that we have the ability and the tools and the power to actually make a big change, and we actually have a good moment. The timing is right. So there's a role for everyone.